Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Jack Parrock. I'm a moderator for Euractiv. Delighted to see you all here in the room and everybody that is joining us online as well. It's great that everyone's here. So we're here for the panel, The Urban Mobility Transition. How can the EU achieve more sustainable transport? Big question, lots to get through. Now, this panel and this discussion that we're going to have this afternoon is essentially rooted in the recently released report by EIT Urban Mobility, who are supporting this event alongside Euractiv as well. They provide established businesses, startups, universities, research institutes, and the public sector with access to markets, talents, funding and knowledge, and they have an accelerator program to help startups scale up. We'll hear a little bit more about what they do, what their work is doing, and also about this important report. It's very interesting. There are copies of it around here. You're going to hear more about what's in the report. And for those of us that are online, you can also find the report in a link somewhere there. Now, one of the things that we will do throughout this hour or so of event is use the Slido tool. That's an opportunity to ask questions, to be able to communicate with what is happening from the audience, both online and here in the room. And to do that, if you're in the room, you can use the QR codes that are stuck onto the walls, or you can go to slido.com and then type in the hashtag is sustainable mobility, and that will then take you to the page where you can drop in questions, and I will see those questions and I will put them to our panelists as we go ahead. If there's any questions about that in the room, you can ask me online. Hopefully that should work. The QR code and the instructions should be there throughout the whole event. It'll pop up. So keep that in a tab opened and you can join in that way. Be great. We actually, just so everybody knows, one of our panelists has dropped out, so it would be wonderful, through illness, it would be wonderful that the audience can sort of step in as a fourth panelist, bring in some of those additional points that perhaps we wouldn't be able to get because he's been unable to join us. Okay. Let's get into it. Maria Tsavakidis is the CEO of EIT Urban Mobility, and she is going to give us a keynote speech about this report that I've flagged up already. Maria, it's wonderful that you're here with us. Thank you. A round of applause.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jack, for the introduction. So I will just briefly introduce the study because I think we will have the opportunity to discuss later on in the panel with my co-panelists. So it is an important moment because, of course, you know that the new commission is forming, and it will all be about not the direction of travel, because the direction of travel is pretty clear. So we need to get to net zero. We need to get the transport system decarbonized. I think almost no one will actually claim it's otherwise. But what about the pathway towards that direction? I think there are many possibilities, and we know that transport is a very complex system. So what is the right way? What is the right way to achieve our very ambitious targets of reducing CO2 emissions by 55% by 2030 and then become net zero by 2050? So this study that we did together with TRT in Italy is looking at the costs and benefits. So why am I saying that? It's because we tend to look at sustainability or sustainable transport from an environmental perspective only, or from a societal perspective only. But what about the economic perspective? So all these three have to actually be looked at the same time, and looking at not only the costs of the transition, which will be enormous, of course, but actually what are the costs of externalities that we can save by making transport more sustainable. And the positive note already at the beginning is that there is net positivity in the end. So the benefits outweigh the costs. And also, we can achieve the ambitious targets, and we can achieve them by 2030. And why I don't really like to speak about 2050 as a horizon, because if we don't achieve the 2030 targets, even if we do achieve the 2050 in the end, we will have, let's say, have overcome the tipping points in so many ways that then being net neutral by 2050 will not help us to, have the climate that we need to have a decent life on Earth. So, as Jack said, this conversation will be grounded in the study. Of course, I don't expect that many of you will have looked into it, but I think Thorsten, Barbara, you will have looked at it. And just to give you a brief overview, so we have done a simulation basically of different combinations of measures that cities can take. And we have looked at what impact will that have on 1,100 cities in Europe in terms of the benefits and the costs, of course. So we differentiated 3 main scenarios. So one scenario being just on the technology innovation side, improving infrastructure, implementing new mobility services, adopting the newest vehicle technology, electrification. While the second scenario looked at, okay, so if we don't adopt innovation, but we do all the regulatory things we can do, so whether that's pricing, parking fees, congestion pricing, low emission zones, so what will the result of that be? And the third one, and you probably already guess, is a combination of both. So, and we call it the zero emission scenario. You might know why we call it the zero emission scenario. So by combining those strict regulations and policies with innovations, we are really driving to a zero emissions future. So the findings are both positive in that they give us hope that change is possible, but also they are a call for action because we see that to achieve the 55%, we need to do a lot of things. And we need to combine both fast adoption of whatever good innovations we have already, and we do need to also apply the regulatory measures and policy measures that we know will disincentivize the wrong behaviors, incentivize the good behaviors. So the transformation comes with a cost. And so what the study shows is we want to get to net zero. It will require investment of 1.5 trillion euros from public and private sectors and households. But then, and this is what I mentioned in the beginning, there is the benefit side. And actually this far outweighs the costs. And so reducing emissions also means economic benefits, also means societal benefits, and it is what the study clearly shows the only way that we can actually go in order to achieve net zero. And it also means we have to act decisively. And with this, I would give over to Jack to invite our panelists. And I would love to hear different perspectives, because actually the scenarios show different perspectives, and we hear some people talking about policy and, regulating very rigidly, while others are very innovation optimistic and say this can actually save us, we don't need regulation. So what is the right pathway?
Perfect. Maria, thank you so much. I'll ask you to take your seat up on the panel, and I'll also invite our other 2 panelists to come up and join us. And for everybody who's watching online, you can actually find the study, and you could probably skim read some of the exec summary if you're looking for it, that's up on the screen right now. So thank you so much, Maria, for the outline. I also have with me Torsten Klimke, who's the Head of Unit for Innovation and Research in DG Move of the European Commission. And I also have Barbara Stoll, who's the Senior Director for Clean Cities at Transport and Environment. It's wonderful that you're here. And sadly, as I said, Thomas Avanzata, the spokesperson for the European Union Committee of the UITP, is unable to join us. He's been taken unwell. So all the best to him if he is watching or if he watches back. We're sending you our best wishes. And as I said, because he's not here, we have a little bit more time, plenty of time from questions from the audience in the room and also online. I'll start with you though, Torsten. Perhaps you can give a bit of an outline of what you've seen in this report so far, these three scenarios where only one reaches net zero or at least hits the Green Deal ambitions. Is that in line with what the Commission sees? I wonder what your take on it is.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. No, indeed, it's a mix of different elements. No? So as Maria already said, you know, we don't believe it's going to be the one or only the other. So it's not only regulation, it's not only technology, you know, but it's a mix. And furthermore, in the EU, we have the principle of subsidiarity. So that means that that the cities themselves actually are the ones who implement. So from the EU side, we can't regulate in a way that maybe is outlined part of it in the report, but that's on local level. So if you talk, for example, think about low emission zones, that's not something that we from the EU side regulate at all. This is something, these are measures that the cities themselves take because they need to deal with the emissions, with the local emissions. So different ways of dealing with that. At the same time, of course, we need technology. Without technology, this doesn't work. So we need a change also of mindset for all of us, and we need affordability, because especially for those who are most affected by it, for those who cannot afford this transition, who have problems with it, and I think we come to that later as well. A bit, we have a new instrument. We actually have new funding with the Social Climate Fund. So it's a mix. It's a mix between measures, regulatory measures to be taken on different levels, not necessarily the EU, but local levels, national levels. It's a mix of technology, innovative leadership, but also provides jobs and employment in the EU, and then funding on the different levels, some on EU level, some on national level, some on level, but not least private funding. So private funding becomes attractive.
Yeah, and that is always the key for investment, and the uptake always really often comes from that private funding in order to get it really moving sometimes. Barbara, I'll come to you. What are your reactions to the scenarios that are laid out, the three scenarios? So innovation and technology being one, the second one being regulatory, and the other being the combined two full force ambition.
Yeah, thank you so much, and delighted to be here today, this afternoon in Brussels. I think before I jump into that, this traffic congestion in Brussels was very sparking to me. And, you know, coming to an event like this, I'm like, oh, interesting. So I started looking it up, and apparently Brussels is the 5th most traffic congested city in Europe and the 10th most congested city in the world. So I think it's very appropriate that we are discussing it here, and we can see how there's quite a lot to do. But yeah, I'm from the Clean Cities campaign, and of course, we are a network of 120 organizations across 20 countries, and we are sort of united by that vision of zero-emission urban mobility. We are working with city-level decision makers and the public, and we're trying to encourage everybody to move from polluting vehicles to active, shared, and electric mobility. So our aims and mission is very much aligned with EIT Urban Mobility, and I think what was really interesting about this study is that we actually released something very similar recently, not so recently, so about 9 months ago. and we called it emission zero. And we worked on the basis of the same model, this so-called MOMOS model by TRT. And basically our conclusions are very, very similar. The only thing we did was we chose more ambitious scenarios. So we're a little more impatient as the Clean Cities campaign. And basically what we can see on the basis of our assessment is that by the 2030s, you can get up to around 90% emission reduction in major European cities. But you have to really want it. And I think that's where I come back to your question, is that, of course, what we see is that not only all those things are necessary that you have talked about just now, but really the political will. And I think that is what at the moment is still missing. I think what we also see is that although cities do have quite a lot of agency to act, they don't have all the agency, because a lot of the times the national budgets and national governments are at odds with city level governments. We know that cities are often progressive and at the forefront of change and innovation, but sometimes national governments are they limit the city's ability to do things. Now, that's not to say, I don't want to be too negative, but I do think that we will need an enormous amount of effort at all of those levels, local, national, and the EU level to really get there and to double down and to really, really, do this transition. I mean, we obviously need to, because 3 out of 4 Europeans live in cities, so we kind of know that. We also know that 96% of those people breathe toxic air every day. So overall, we have a lot to do, and I'm just excited to dive in deeper with you all today to discuss that.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you mentioned about the different levels of governance and government. That we'll definitely talk about that in a minute. How do we do that? Maria, I suppose for you, this is something that you're pushing on, and you have clearly made a statement about what the report says. Does EIT Urban Mobility endorse one of these scenarios? Are you saying we need to do that, or are you just trying to lay out the facts here?
I think it became pretty clear what we endorse. It's, of course, the net zero scenario, and this is why we called it net zero, because that is the aim and the goal, whereas the other scenarios are actually just suboptimal, let's say, and they're focusing on a subset of measures that can be taken, but in the end you have to change the system, and to change the system you really have to take all the right measures at once. And I'm glad to hear that there are more optimistic scenarios as well. We took a realistic stance, let's say. Still, I think it's ambitious, so if we reach the 55%, with all the measures that we have simulated there, we still don't get to 55. It's like we get to 52%. So we would still need new solutions somewhat, or, be much faster than we think. So the current trends are showing, let's say. And to come back to what Barbara said, I think, the clean air is something that we have not really focused on so far. There is a bit of a lack of public awareness where everyone is really impacted today, almost everyone in Europe. So we have focused on CO2 emissions because, of course, this is the most urgent thing for humanity to survive, while clean air is something that is important for people to survive today and to not die. But could be, I think, a route to take in the narrative, the combined, so the emission reduction and the clean air, to reach people that today, I think, with the CO2 narrative and the greenhouse gas emissions narrative cannot be reached. So I would very much love, actually, to put the two sides together.
Can I stay with you just for a second? Perhaps to visualize this a little bit more. If this third scenario, which you're suggesting, it were to be fully implemented, what would it mean? What would it sort of practically look like? Every bus is electric or hydrogen?
No.
Every car is... Do you see what I mean? What do our
totally.
cities look like if this comes out?
Right. Okay. So let me give you a few examples. So let's take private cars, okay? Because some people think, okay, we will have from 2035 onwards, you know, the ban of the internal combustion engine cars means there will not be everything will be electric. Of course, that's not the case, because every car that has been sold before that, ICE, will still run on roads. So what the scenario says, a net zero scenario, is that we will have around, I think, 25% electric vehicles in the fleet. So that's totally doable, let's say. Regarding the modal share, so we can reduce from 46% of private motorized traffic in Europe to 30%. So reduce it by 16%. Again, that sounds doable, right? It's not like magic. And these 16% that people will not take their cars will have to then be shifted to public transport, to cycling, to walking. And again, it's doable because we know that many of the trips today done by private cars are less than 5 kilometers or even less than 1 kilometer. So I think 2/3 are less than 5. It's totally doable by bicycle for most people. Torsten, you say you ride your bike here in Brussels. And so many people can do that. Those who can't, of course, can still use their cars. And there will be still cars, and we don't assume that everything will be electric by 2030.
It's really interesting. I don't want to harp on about Brussels too much, because there are big arguments in this city specifically about how the urban transport is run. And as you mentioned, Barbara, probably if you look out the window down the boulevard at the end of the road there, you'll see some traffic right now. But the reality is that it's not quite the huge numbers, 100% of the fleet electric. It's not like that at the moment. And a lot of people are transferring over to different forms of transport. Let's talk a bit about the money, though, because transitions require money, Torsten. Where is the money for this? Is this EU money? You mentioned already that the cities get their own decision on how they structure their transport. How does it work from the Commission here to the cities in the far-flung sort of corners of the European Union?
Yep. I'd like to link the money actually with the people. Sure. We talked about it. But ultimately, what we want to achieve, what we need to achieve, is good mobility for everyone. Good freight transport as well. So, I mean, our cities need good mobility, not good connections from the outside. We get more and more deliveries nowadays. So this kind of overall transport mix. So it needs to be a comprehensive plan. And that's where it links with the money, because if you want to access money, if you want someone to give you money, you have to have a good plan. So how do we achieve comprehensive planning? And that's actually something that the EU can do, and where the EU can help, and where the EU is involved, because we have the sustainable urban mobility plans. So this is something that is actually now EU law. Since we have the 10T regulation, the new 10T regulation, there is a law that says the 431 largest European cities, I should say urban areas, because it's not only the city, it goes around the city, have to do these plans. And they have to involve the public, they have to involve stakeholders, industry in drawing up these plans. And ultimately, who's in charge of the city and the mobility in the city are the mayors, are the elected politicians. And they are also the ones who are in charge of financial decisions, at least on the local level. So if it links in with the funding and the planning, then it will be easier also to access not only EU funding, because we have these links with the Sustainable Urban Mobility plans, but also with private investment. Because if there is a clear plan and it is clear where the city is going or the urban area, then it will become easier to access private funding, because these enormous figures that we have heard about from Maria, this is nothing that can be paid by EU budget. That is not something that can be paid by the national budgets. It needs to be a combination of different instruments. And I mentioned the Social Climate Fund, which is actually a new instrument. So we're talking about 65 billion billion euro additional funding that is becoming available for the member states to help with this transition, not only in the transport sector, but also in the building sector. And that's something where we want to raise also awareness at national level, but also at local level, to look into this funding and see how it can be used to keep mobility affordable or make it more affordable for those who need it most.
Yeah, and this is it, like you say, every city has a different set of sort of challenges that it has to deal with. Let's move on. It's sort of related to this, Barbara, because acceptability is really important here as well. It's all well and good to have wonderful plans, and if we're talking about electric cars, for instance, we can have them all on the forecourts, but people have to buy them. Is there a disconnect between what needs to be done and citizens accepting or even wanting to do what needs to be done to green the cities?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you ask me, because I actually received death threats because of some of the work that we have been doing in some cities. So this is like the mic drop moment. But so I will tell the story. So at the city level, of course, we have seen a major backlash against low emission zones, and in London in particular, which isn't an EU city, but nevertheless an important European city, when Sadiq Khan announced the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, and he was foreseeing a 9-month sort of period, so not a huge amount of advance notice. Some very vocal minority groups, as in, there's a vocal minority in society who really took that badly, and basically they started going after groups like mine, the Clean Cities campaign, but also they vandalized cameras. They actually blew up cameras, which caused real damage, but also safety concerns for citizens who lived right near by those cameras, etc., etc. So we've seen a huge backlash against basically more restrictions on cars, essentially, because that's what low emission zones are. But we also know that low emissions are some of the most effective measures, at the very least in the short term, to really kind of start cleaning up the fleet and to encourage the electrification of the cars on our roads. And so yes, I would say that there is a small part of society that really strongly pushes back. But what we also see, and this is sort of on the sort of more positive side, is that no matter how much backlash there is, it usually is. You can sort of see that it is driven by a very small number of people who are very, very loud, and who are also funded by dark forces, let's just put it that way. But the majority of people, and this is what we see from our sort of pan-European polling, where we were polling urbanites, and 59% of Europeans in large cities generally support their mayor to do more on polluting vehicles and to eventually phase out polluting vehicles. So I would say the majority is silently supportive, but the minority is very vocally against these measures. And these measures are really hard. Politicians are very worried that they won't be re-elected, of course. Now, we also see good examples there, because Sadiq Khan has won a landslide in London recently. Again, I apologize, it's not an EU city, but I think it is a good example for a city where everything went bonkers because of the low emission zone, yet he has been re-elected for another term. So we see that there isn't a complete correlation between, someone does brave things to clean up transport and then doesn't get re-elected. We can also see Anne Hidalgo, of course, who has done amazing things, and she has been
swam in the Seine to try and
well, that too. That too. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think there is that moment just before a measure like this gets implemented or becomes stricter, where backlash is at its peak. And then just after that, things do start calming down, because once these things are in place, people accept it. Like, that's how behavior change, that's how behavior happens, is that there's this huge peak in emotion, and everybody's like kicking against it. And then once the measure is in place, the large majority of cases shows that things do calm down, people get used to it, and people do start sort of adapting to the new reality. So anyway, I said a lot of things there, but
no. It's firstly, I'm sorry that you're receiving death threats for that work. That is clearly, I mean, when you think about what we're talking about, it's like,
I know.
Transport, these are...
You would think it's boring, right? and yet it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, but people do feel really strongly about it. But also, I mean, London is a good example because it was very strident, especially in the ultra-low emission zones, and big cities can learn from that as well. I think it's interesting. I actually moved from London to Brussels over 11 years ago now, and I never bought a car when I arrived here because this city was just not... I always had a car in the UK, and when I moved here, I didn't buy one, and I only ride my bike and use public transport because it's a traffic city. I was like, I can't be bothered. And this is the adoption. We adapt to what we like. I'll come to you, Maria, because this situation, firstly, the heat of it is one thing, but there also is a narrative shift, or perhaps needs to be a narrative shift between sort of biking eco-warriors taking away our lovely fancy cars and actually making it about normal people living in a city wanting to live in a nice, healthy city that isn't smogged up and that they can access around, right? It's important to return it down into that level of conversation.
Absolutely. I think we should more on what is our joint and common interests, like having a good quality of life in the city, green areas, clean air, low noise. I mean, who would actually say they are against this? So really talk more about the life that we want in a city, or how we want the city to look like, than the measures to get there, and then say, okay, someone who rides a bicycle is like one species, and then a driver is another, because also that's not true. I mean, many people who have a car also ride their bikes to work, and then they use their car only on weekends, or maybe... So I had a car until 5 years ago, and then I was using it just maybe twice a month or once a month, and then once I really forgot where I parked it, and then I said, and I needed to take the car at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then I said, okay, I have to get rid of this car because I'm not using it. So we have to just become more balanced, and I think we have to fall back on what science is telling us and what other figures telling us. And this is why also we did that study, to bring it down to figures and facts and say what really works, and what is the combination of things that will get us to where we need to get, instead of saying it's either or, because it's not true. Either or won't get us anywhere. And coming back on that acceptance thing, also that's quite a complex thing, to get people to change behaviors, because no one in this room, not me, not you probably, Barbara, wants to be instructed what to do, or to have to change something that we grew fond of. So we need a motivation. We need a motivation, and then we also need the ability to take on a different habit. And in mobility, that means motivation can be affordability, right? So if I heard in Munich, my hometown, so we introduced during COVID a €9 ticket for public transport, so everyone could really afford public transport, where before they might not have been able to. And I heard that there are kids in the northern part of the city, socially a bit, left behind.
Yeah.
And they were never in the city center because they couldn't afford to take the metro to get into the city center. So with this €9 ticket, then finally they could actually go with their classes to the city center of Munich and experience their city. So the ability and giving them the option is really important. So we have to always balance those two things and never think that it's clear you have to do this because this is the right behavior.
Yeah, Torsten,
yeah, thanks. It's a very good point that you mentioned, actually. And Thomas, if he had been with us, he would have mentioned it already, and rightly so. Because this very emotional discussion between I want to use the car, I have to use the bike, or the other way around. That's actually not the solution. Neither the car nor the bike is the solution. If we really want solutions for our cities, it's public transport. Because mass transport is what we really need. So without mass transport, together with cycling, together with cars when they are needed. So this overall approach, this approach of all the different modes together, this is what we need for the cities. And we can see that. You mentioned that public transport in general. If we have a good and attractive public transport system that transports most people along kind of the major routes, then this can be something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's happening with this. Some of them are cutting a little bit. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. We'll bring a hand mic, yeah. Apologies to everyone who's watching online for this. I think there's a slight issue with the microphones. Thank you for your patience. I think everyone in the room can hear, but let's bring you this microphone. Thanks, Torsten.
Thanks very much. No, that's maybe that's better.
Yeah.
And that's also what we're saying in our general strategic approach. We have an urban mobility framework, which was last updated 2021, 3 years ago. That says public transport is the backbone and has to be the backbone, not only within the city, but also for connecting for commuters, but even further for connecting rural areas and the city. Because mobility in the city is not only for those living in the city, it's also for those who actually want to get to the city, for work, but also for leisure, for tourism. We have more and more people visiting cities, large cities for touristic purposes. And ultimately, they need to get there, and so we need to have this transport mix of all the different measures, and in particular, public transport.
I'm going to stay with you for a second and just ask you a little bit. We touched on the sort of political, well, not really the political climate, but across the European Union, there are political parties winning elections who are against green ambitions, specifically things like cities, specifically taking away cars and stuff, or what is perceived as that. How does the European Commission work around this when you've got these ambitions and these goals that you're trying to roll out? What's your thinking behind how to sort of navigate that changing political climate?
Yeah. We have to get, and we want to get the discussion a little bit away from this very heated and to a degree where you receive death threats to what we actually want to achieve here. We don't want to take anyone's car away or force them on a bike that they're not comfortable with riding. We want to provide good alternatives for everyone, for their mobility. And I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. If you say, you will get you should have an appropriate offer of mobility, and it should be a good one. If you currently don't use your bike or don't use a bike, maybe something can be done to make it attractive for you. And if you never want to use a bike or you can't use a bike, then there needs to be good and attractive public transport, door-to-door solutions. So to get you from the train station to your home and the other way around, where you don't need to worry to a degree where you say, I have to use the car because I can't rely on the other offers. So we need to take a bit these very heated emotions out of it and come more to the what do we jointly want to achieve, and what is our joint future. And the joint future is also decarbonization. It's whichever way you might currently see an electric car. The long-term alternative isn't using fossil fuels. It can't be. Because we're even running out of them. No? When I was young, the threat was we're running out of oil. Yeah. We need to find alternatives because we don't have any oil anymore. Now it is rightly about the emissions, but it's the truth is it's both. No? I mean, this is not a technology that will last. And the sooner we can get this transition, and the sooner we get people to join us on this transition in Europe, because we want to also have the technology in Europe. We want to be the first with this transition, the best with this transition. No? That's our ambition. The better. So take the emotions out a little bit and focus on what we jointly want to achieve.
So Barbara, talk to me about investments as well. I mean, you said you're suggesting a very ambitious plan. How does that get funded? Who has the obligation most to fund these things? I know there's obviously EU money, but we've already heard it needs to come from the cities and the sort of local, regional level as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question, right? So pun intended. Sorry, I just had to do that. So I think that, you know, like we've talked about how transforming urban mobility is such a gigantic challenge that we all at all levels need to work together. And I think it's not only about, you know, good communication, lead in time, providing incentives and alternatives to people, gentle communication, you know, participatory processes, but also about the money, really. And I think, you know, in a world that's currently choked by multiple crises, it's a little hard and harder to find that money. So of course, there's a lot that cities can do, though, and what we have seen across Europe and the kind of most ambitious cities that are sort of the front runners when it comes to, you know, sustainable urban mobility, they have provided certainty. And I think that's the number one thing, because once they basically by setting targets, by setting goals that, yes, I am going to be zero emission by 2030 or 2035, you know, I am going to implement a zero emission zone whole of my city, you know, Amsterdam being one of them, right? And that plan started many years ago. Like basically they started in 2019 and they're about to roll out the first zero emission zones, which will ultimately have a huge impact on electrifying the fleets and of course everything else alongside that they're doing. So what we hear from businesses that we are also working together with across Europe is that they need this predictability. They need the city to really commit, for there to be a longer term and a midterm target, and for that to be crystal clear and not change and not be withdrawn and not be sort of rolled back, but for that to be there, because then businesses will come on board as well. So then the city won't be left alone to have to fund all this, especially with you know, potentially empty pockets at the moment with the current climate. But you know, businesses will come on board, and then you know, public-private partnerships can form, and also it makes business sense, right? Because if you are a front runner, you are basically going to generate a competitive advantage, and we see this at the moment. So we're working with multiple business alliances across Europe, in Milan, London, Paris, and a lot of these businesses really want the cities to commit to, for example, zero emission zones for freight, because what that means is that, you know, in a particular zone of the city, only zero emission vans and potentially heavier vehicles can circulate. So the kind of the cost of the transition falls on the businesses, but these businesses can do it if they have the certainty and the long-term sort of visibility that that will be the thing, and then eventually everybody will transition. So those will be the two things, you know, that I would say are a must. And of course, EU and national level funding have to play a role as well. And it has to be what we are seeing from the front-runner cities such as Amsterdam and some of the Dutch cities, is that, you know, there's a national framework in place, and then the regions and the cities are all working together. They're working, you know, with the businesses, with academia. So it's a real big sort of cross collaboration in order to deliver this, because, you know, the scale of the challenge requires it.
Huge. Do you know what? I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions that we've got online. Our audience have done us proud and really filled in as I asked them to. I'm very, very happy. And one of the questions, I'll bring as many as I can in. We'll start getting through them now. One of the questions comes from Marie Moulin, who says that it's on this, and I'm going to add a bit to her question and come to you, Maria. How to support cities in achieving these goals at EU level, country level, and city level. And I would also add not just to support, but to make sure that there aren't contradictions between them. How do we make sure that everything moves in the same direction?
So what we are doing at EIT Urban Mobility is facilitating that knowledge exchange, the best practices, so that not every city has to start from scratch, but they can actually learn from the pilots that happened, and also move a little bit out of that pilot after pilot after pilot, and actually create an avenue of a pilot to lead to procurement of a solution and to scaling of solutions. So that is one of our missions, to scale innovations. So that their cities need support. Of course, they need the funding, but then also they need this intermediary that we are between the innovators. So oftentimes, these are small companies, SMEs, startups that are not used to working with cities, which have quite complex processes. And on the other hand, cities are not used to working with startups. They are used to working with the big companies, the tier one suppliers that have the muscle to actually go through lengthy processes with the cities. They have a lot of staff to cater to the city's needs and so forth. So this bringing in or facilitating the collaboration, but then also disseminating, the knowledge, the insights from successful pilots is important. And then cities need everything that was mentioned, so they need access to direct access to funding from national funds, from EU funds, where today they are, let's say, depending on the national governments to allocate enough funding for the clean transition. And something I wanted to also say, so the clear pathway that we are describing is so important, because exactly of what Barbara said, is we cannot afford to go two pathways. So we have to focus also the resources, the funding. We have to focus it on a clear pathway, and this is why the automotive industry in Europe is in the state that it is, because they have tried to go both ways. They haven't gone full in on electric. We see the results of that right now. So it was only done as a sidekick somehow, and that destroyed the traction was just or is not enough to compete with Europe and with the US and China on electric cars.
It's literally what we're seeing today. The protests of
Exactly.
VW is literally on this very day kicking off. Torsten, please.
Thanks. Maria mentions a very important point here, the capabilities also of the cities, because that's something we see that on a city administrative level, it's a matter of money, of course, but it's also a matter of actually planning the measures. Most cities will be able to, if they need to procure 5 additional buses, to procure 5 diesel buses, because they're used to this, they have the procedures, they know how to do this. But how do you now make sure that the next 5 buses are zero emission? How can they be electric or fuel cell electric? What do you need to plan? You need to plan the recharging. How do I do this? So this kind of planning capacity is really important. And sometimes cities need support and they ask for support. We're doing this, for example, with the 100 climate neutral cities, which are supported via Horizon Europe. But we also do this via Jaspers. It's coming from the European Investment Bank. Support to cities to help them understand the planning steps and understand how they can actually facilitate this transition. So because they need to draw up the plans, the local plans, and then afterwards access to finance to implement it. But they need to first, be able to understand the challenge, plan this transition, access the funding, and then execute in a way that makes it for them possible to go from buying the next time the diesel buses to buying electric or
It has to be a business case. Like the city sort of runs as a business. Are these buses going to last us for X number of years? Are we going to be able to get them across? We need to sell them and change them away. There's loads to that. Let me stay with you. There's a question from Thomas Limes that's come in, which is directed towards you, which is about the Sustainable Transport Investment Plan, which is in the pipeline at the new Commission. To what extent will this help improve urban mobility, is his question. I wonder if you can give us as much detail as you can of what's going on.
It is indeed, unfortunately, Thomas, it is indeed at a very, very early stage. So, I mean, there's very little I could now say concretely on that. But of course, the input and the ideas from stakeholders are very much welcome to that regard. So, it's not yet there. I mean,
lots of anticipation about what's coming there. It was expected that somebody would ask about that. I'm going to move now to a question from, I had a bit of a Greek lesson with Maria earlier, and I may butcher this surname. I'm just going to go with Konstantinos, who's in the room with us as well, I think. We're getting that both technological and regulatory measures need to be taken, which can lead to decarbonisation, which relates to implementation. To what extent is this process monitored? Are there indicators and data sharing methods? Perhaps Barbara, I don't know if you can come in on that, or we can, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we regularly do is we do rank cities, on their preparedness on the pathway towards a fully sustainable urban mobility system. So we regularly launch rankings, which cities don't always like, because those that don't do so well, of course, they don't like to see themselves on the bottom. But there are multiple indicators and KPIs in the various categories of sustainable urban transport where you can track the progress. And what I can say is that we see that cities. Some cities have done an enormous amount in a very short space of time, and even cities where you wouldn't expect them. So, for example, Budapest in Central and Eastern Europe, they have done loads on shared mobility recently. But there's lots of great examples from across Europe, and I keep coming back to this point that it is about the political will. It is about setting the goals and the targets, and then things do fall into place when the cities really want it. So we are informally basically looking at and monitoring the progress, but I'm sure the Commission has more to say on that.
It's difficult for you to know what is happening everywhere at all times in these different levels, Torsten.
Indicators, indeed. We are talking about indicators, and we're working on the indicators, not for the purpose that Barbara mentioned. So it's not about ranking at all of cities, but it is rather to help cities also with their progress. I mentioned the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. This framework that we have for the 431 largest urban areas. And together with this, the regulation, which is new in place now on 10T, actually also requires the introduction of indicators. So sustainable urban mobility indicators, or as we rather call them now, urban mobility indicators, because one area these indicators will look into is actually safety. So safety is an important one. I think everyone can understand that, especially if we want this transition from to more active mobility, cycling and others. We need to make it safe and safer than it is. So the other area is accessibility, to have good access actually to mobility services. And the third one is sustainability. So and to measure in these areas, but not to rank cities and to say you're the best and you're not so good, but to help also the cities to understand how they are progressing over time, and to have so we have a harmonized framework for sustainable urban mobility planning, which is then adapted locally for each of the urban areas, and we will have in around July of next year, hopefully, a framework also with indicators to measure progress on a local level and to help local administrations to measure also where they're going. So these indicators will be adopted, will be ready next year. But cities will have time before they report on them. It will only be the end of 2027 where they actually need to report, so to prepare. And we're also not leaving them on their own, but we are helping them on this process. So indeed, measuring, if you have a plan, you need to measure. What's your baseline and how do you get there?
That of course the rankings are not there to annoy people. They are there to actually help cities, because sometimes they find it, at least in our interactions with the cities, they find it really helpful to see how others are doing and how they are doing, you know, as compared with a similar size, you know, city with similar levels of population. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well.
It's part of that, like, to hold up a good example, but don't use it as a stick to beat everyone else with.
Yeah.
If there's a balance there, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And cities do look at each other, because sometimes, you know, and this has been mentioned before, that, you know, they don't always have the staff. So they're often very busy doing their own thing, and you know, they don't necessarily have the capacity to see what others are doing, and they're just, you know, trying to get through the everydays and the huge demands on them, and of course, you know, comparisons like this can really help them and help them shape their plans and be inspired by the best practices, and I think that's why it's quite an important, alongside, you know, more robust official data. And then the other thing I think that is, you also mentioned this, that we have found whilst gathering the data from cities, that often they don't have that data available. So sometimes, you know, we would find ourselves in a position where we look into various databases on, for example, the length of, you know, the number of kilometers of cyclepaths, and then we find one thing, and then the city tells us another, which is a smaller number, and then we're like, okay, so where is the truth? So I think one of the other things that now the commission process is also encouraging cities to do is to be better at gathering the data, because if we don't have a data, you know, it's like a baseline, then how do we ever measure progress, and how do we know where we're headed? So one of the things, these rankings are also helpful, and also, of course, the sumps.
Yeah, just to add to everything that was said, we cannot measure today everything that we would have, or cities would have to measure, in fact. So CO2 emission measurements, so there is a lot of innovation in the space happening. Apart from, wanting to measure and having the indicators, we also need to support innovative startups who actually bring new ways to measure CO2 emissions, but also other emissions like particulate matter. And so one thing that we have not mentioned is, so even if we make the fleet all electric, we will still have non-exhaust emissions from tire, brake wear in cars, so road vehicles, but then also braking of rail vehicles. So public transport does have non-exhaust emissions that are very, very unhealthy. And so in 2050, so when we will have electrified the fleets mostly, 90% of the emissions will be non-exhaust emissions. And we don't have the solutions today to actually reduce them enough. So there's still a lot that we have to do that we are not focusing on today, because of course there are other priorities, but we will have to look forward and say, okay, so how do we actually, reduce those other harmful emissions as well, and how do we measure it as well?
There are a lot of solutions and innovations being built, actually. I'm not saying but I've seen stuff. I've seen these extractors from brakes that pull out all the particulates as you're going forward. Mm-hmm. But it's about rolling them out. It's small startup companies that have a solution, but this needs to be entirely across the fleet, and that requires big investment as well. It's a really important point there. Let's move on. There's some more questions. There was a question from I wanted to bring this up actually when we were talking about this before. This is a good question. At this stage, pollution reduction measures, like we talked about London and the low emission zones, etc., lead to strong exclusion of the most vulnerable populations, says JM. and seem to precede any adaptation measures. How can we involve the population in its entirety and not just the most privileged part of the population? So, people can afford expensive electric bikes and pay the money to get into the emission zones. Anyone that can come in, Maria, you can go.
Yeah, so there are examples where actually the money is put where the need is biggest. So in France, they have the social leasing scheme, so where those that cannot afford an electric car get actually a very low leasing rate for an electric vehicle. So I think we have to allocate the funds and the incentives and the support there, where otherwise, people just are not able to do the right thing. And instead of blanket funding all, electric company fleets, for instance, like it was done in Germany, then they stopped it. Now they are discussing to reintroduce it. So why fund it across the board when actually people who can afford it, don't need to be motivated, while the others who cannot afford it, for them it's a decisive barrier for adoption.
Yeah. Barbara, please.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, because we've done some research on this as well, and some of the most important measures do include actually social leasing. So that is a fabulous measure to really help, those that are socially disadvantaged, and so to get them up to speed with the transition. But also scrappage schemes tend to work well when they're targeted, in the right way. Also public transport pass discounts, and of course the Munich €9 ticket comes to mind here. But we've looked at lots of different measures, and that also can really help, the most vulnerable to be part of this transition. And then finally, bike purchase discounts and incentives can also really help. So these 5 measures are what we have found to be the most effective. And I think you're right in saying that this transition cannot just leave behind the most vulnerable, but it has to be done in a way that not only they come with us, but that they are going to be better off as a result. And of course, at the end of this, I do have a vision where we are trying to build cities and transport systems that will serve everybody, and actually it will serve everybody much better than cities do today. So that would be what I would say.
I come back to how this is linked to the sustainable urban mobility plans and the different kind of planning levels that you have. So if you're a citizen of the city, you can contact your city administration. Or if you are living outside the city, but you regularly need to commute to the city for work purposes, for example. Because in this sustainable urban mobility plans, these are meant to capture all the needs, in particular the needs of the most vulnerable, to have them in there. And then if we get to funding, and when we get to funding, the cities themselves, they can contact their national levels, because what we also recommended for these sustainable urban mobility plans to member states, that they set up national coordination for the different cities. If you take Germany, for example, has more than 70 different cities who have to set up sustainable urban mobility plans. So there is there would be there are advantages in having coordination. We see how this is happening in several member states. So, and the national level actually is where then the social climate funding comes in, because the social climate funding, 65 billion euros coming from the emission trading system in the future, they're actually going to the national level. And then the national level allocates to those who most need, so either to the transport side or to housing, a building side. And they then allocate also to the different local measures. So I mean, there's a whole kind of cascade in there. We are not able from a European level, and we're not mandated either, to look into each and every city and see what they're doing there. But you have this kind of cascade in there, and the framework in place.
Yeah, and that's it. This is what we were talking about, making sure there's no contradictions as well. I'm gonna take the sort of three questions that follow on, cascade on, if I may steal your term a little bit from this, and I'll read all three of them, and then if you'd like to come in on what they've said, I think they're slightly related. So George Xenocrates, I can do that one. 2-in-1. He says 2-in-1 shared rides. 1 in 2 shared rides requested in cities such as Dublin, Milan, Rome, Barcelona or Athens cannot be served due to outdated local rules. The alternative is often used in a private car. Users want to switch to shared modes, but local rules often make them less available and affordable. What can change? That's that question. Jean-Thomas Ringeval, I think is how it would be pronounced, says, at short term, is there any preferred mass transport system to be developed in Europe? Is there one sort of focal point system? I think that that question leads on. And Philippa Silva said, sort of relevant to this, test different ticket prices on public transports to mitigate rush hours. We talked a little bit about the €9 ticket. Luxembourg made their public transport free. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about systems, basically. What are the best systems? Are there silver bullets? Are there things that we absolutely should do across the board? Perhaps Maria.
Start. Okay, so there are no silver bullets. I think we made that clear already before. What the study does actually is look at different sizes of cities and what is then this cost-benefit balance in the end for a big city or a small city, depending on the measures. And what you see is that, of course, for a small city, an investment into a metro doesn't make any sense, or maybe not even a tram, because it's a huge investment and it's a small, area where it's best fed with buses, for instance. So you need to really choose the mode of transport, also mass transport or public transport, according to the topology of the city. In small cities, or very small towns, let's say, maybe not even buses are the right measure. Maybe there where you only have like a few trips, very scattered across the day, you might need demand responsive transport, which is something I think we need to develop faster, because it's something you need in all urban areas, even in the big metropolitan areas. On the fringes, you have very sparsely populated areas with small number of trips, where having a big bus run every 10 minutes just doesn't make sense. So how do you serve those areas? And there's exciting, actually, developments in that area. So what about autonomous shared shuttles? Small vehicles, electric, autonomous, that can serve those areas and actually totally change also the economic model, because taking out the driver of the system reduces the operating cost by so much and makes it, in the long run, possible for a city or a town to run such a system. So no silver bullet. You really have to look at the context, and there might be a business case even for public transport in sparsely populated areas with the right solutions.
I know I sound a bit like a scratched record now, referring over and over again to the sustainable mobility plans, but if you happen to be living in one of these 431 cities, and you can actually check them in the legislation, so there's a list of these cities, then the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan should address, and we believe will address, the different needs and the different areas. And you say, yeah, but why isn't it done yet? And because also these plans, even though many cities have them already or have elements for these plans, are also a legal requirement only by the end of 2027. No? So from the end of 2027, or let's say the early 2028, each of these cities has to have this plan. But until then, they have time, and they're using the time. We know from many cities that they're actually in this process now. They're ramping this up as well a bit. So get in contact with your local administration, because the gentleman there, I think we referred to local rules. indeed, go to those and talk to those who are actually making those local rules, and ask them about it. Talk to them, send them messages. You can also contact us at the European Commission, but what we are going to recommend to you is also, again, go to the local level, because there is not much we can do and not much that we should do. This is subsidiarity. That means that the concrete implementation, also related to the other question, should it be a metro, a bus, a tram, a combination of those? This is down to the local level. This is nothing that we can and that we want to regulate on the European level, because we can't. How can we understand for 431 cities what each of them actually needs?
It's really interesting as well. When you talk, we all know where people that are living in Brussels know where the blocked points are, that road out there, like I said already. But, I don't know what the blocked part of Stuttgart is, or which bus is always blocked, or which tram always gets caught when we just don't know that unless you live in the city. And fundamentally, it takes all politics back down to the local level. Barbara, I wonder if you can talk to me about models.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Maria's point that I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all model because of the different sizes, the different realities. We also know that certain cities are ahead in certain ways, and really certain cities, coming back to the money point, just have more resources. So they are, perhaps they can play with a little bit of a different toolkit than other cities. I think we're coming kind of back to the basics, which has been mentioned on this panel already, which is, any healthy urban transport system has to be, the backbone of that has to be public transport. It has to be affordable, it has to be accessible, and it has to be reliable, right? And we know that where the public transport systems are the most successful, so, in places like Vienna, for example, comes to mind as a good example, Paris is a good example, even Budapest is a good example, they all have this. It's affordable, it's reliable, and so therefore people don't feel the need to, I have to have a car because, if the bus doesn't come, I have to get to work, right? So we know that, every city has to sort of invest in that, and whether that investment is a large metro, which would only make sense if there are millions of people and it's a gigantic metropolitan area, or whether that's the procurement of electric buses, or even just a bus lane, right? A bus lane does not cost very much, but it can nevertheless really enhance the efficiency and the reliability of certain services. So I know, for example, Warsaw is really choked with traffic, like many other European cities. But one of the solutions that the groups over there are advocating for is just simple bus lanes, so that those electric buses get the priority, and so they can actually, do their job and transport people and provide that reliability so that people don't feel the need to then drive to the places where they need to get to. I think the other thing is that we have to give people alternatives. So there's an interesting research that was done in, of all places, in Australia. Sorry that I'm bringing that in, but it was, sorry. But they did look into what would make Australians ditch their cars, and they found that you need to give people 4 alternatives before they are willing to consider ditching their car, or like letting go of owning a car. And I thought that was extremely interesting, and it really resonates with what we're seeing and what we're finding, that even when we know that cars are parked 95% of the time, it's still a bit of a life insurance for people, because they're like, well, if I can't do my journeys otherwise, or every once in a while I have to go to IKEA, right? Or I have to take my baby to, I don't know, the hospital that's a bit further away. So anyway, that tells you something, that I think we really need to, on a systemic level, step away from a car-centric, car-dominated reality to a more public transport-dominated reality. And of course, for short journeys, we need to make it possible, safe, and easy for people to walk, wheel, and cycle. And I am also a big advocate of micromobility. I know that may not make me very popular. I know Brussels has done things recently. I know Paris has banned them. But if you, for example, combine micromobility solutions with public transport, just stations or stops, and you create these mobility hubs, then that sort of last mile that people would need to walk, they can just jump on a scooter in a regulated, nice, slow way, and they can really complete their journey, and they won't feel like they have to drive to the station. So those are the kind of very integrated thinking that I would like to see really happen in European cities. And I think we need all of the solutions, really, that's been talked about. I think that's the whole point. It's not an either or. We need everything, everyone, all at once to get there.
I'm trying to think now of my 4 options. What are my 4?
Yeah.
Maria.
Yeah, just because you asked system level. So it's really important to not just focus on the people living in the city. Because if you look at who is actually driving their cars in the city, so in some cities 50% is commuters that are coming from outside of the city into the city, or commuters that live in the city and work outside of the city. So you really have to look at it from understand, first of all, who is moving and for what, and then provide the right solutions for all of those different trips that are made and people living in different areas of a region.
There are some additional questions here. John Emmanuel wrote whether our participants are aware of the next generation of smart urban transit technology being developed in the UK with the first deployments in the Middle East. I've gone on the link while we've been up here, actually. It's worth looking at, but I think it's too difficult for you guys to react to. Just one other final question that is actually quite interesting, and this is from Abhishek, who says, are we talking about as we're talking about funding from citizens as well, how are we ensuring, and I think this is interesting to bring it back finally to the citizens as stakeholders are involved in this transition to reduce the traction while there's implementation or reduce the resistance as well? A quick comment from all 3 of you, if I can, about citizens' involvement, and then we'll wrap up the time. I'll start with you, Torsten.
Thanks. Well, we actually do quite often, if it's any kind of regulation that we do or even new policies, you can make yourself heard. Huh? So for all of those, there is actually a database. There's an access on EU level. Huh? So if you have not used it yet, please see, and you can even send us emails if you can't find it. That's one way of making yourself heard as an individual in the EU to the EU institutions. You can make yourself heard regularly every 4 or 5 years. You vote national, but you also vote local, and ask your politicians. What have you done? How are you implementing this? And then you have a choice. You can vote. And if I may, as kind of where can you find more information from us? One thing I haven't mentioned, the ELTIS database. So we have an ELTIS database where you find loads of information about things that I was only able to touch very briefly. What is the EU doing? But also good examples from cities where they have implemented certain measures. So quite a comprehensive database. Please have a look out for it. ELTIS, it's called.
Thank you, Torsten. Barbara, a final thought from you.
Yeah, I think I've already mentioned this, that it is critical to involve citizens from the very get-go when any big measure or change that a city is thinking of implementing, when the idea of it comes up. And I think another very, very important thing is to provide ample time for citizens to get used to the idea of something coming, because then, of course, pre-compliance kicks in, meaning that, even before something is enforced, people already start changing their behavior because that's on their mind. And when there is enough lead-in time, then there is space for that to happen. But also, very, very importantly, creating those public consultation moments. And of course, locally, we see that cities are doing that to, more or lesser extent. But it is really, really crucial to communicate from the city end very consciously, very intentionally, and in a sort of in a way that doesn't fuel further those emotions that we talked about, taking the heat out, but actually, creating a vision that, we are building a better city for you. Please tell us what you think. And I think the other thing is that the city then needs to do is really listen to those concerns, and really then target the support and the incentives to those that need it most.
Thank you. And Maria, a final thought.
So what we have seen is that experimentation helps the acceptance of people. So if you tell them this is only an experiment, it's going to be for a limited amount of time for you to experience and give us feedback, they're much more accepting. And then while they are actually experiencing, they are starting also to change their mindsets. So pilots are oftentimes not actually a test to validate whether the solution is right, but rather to create that acceptance of people. And we've seen that. So in Stockholm, there was a road tolling pilot on a bridge. And of course, road tolling is like one of the most contested measures. And people were totally against it. But then after the test, they asked them, so would you like to actually make this permanent? And people voted yes. So seeing is believing. And this is why involving citizens and pilots is so important. And I would not do too much just talking, consultation, because that doesn't really lead to a lot. But actually implement stuff, but in a temporary way, and then based on the support of citizens, make it permanent.
Perfect. Okay, we've even run over time. There was our audience here in the room and online gave us so many questions, and I wanted to get to as many as possible. A huge thank you to Maria, to Barbara, and Torsten. Can we have a round of applause, please? And a big thank you to everyone who's joined us. I hope that this has been as interesting for you as it has been for me. Yeah, and thanks to the team as well for sorting the mics out quickly. That was great of them. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon or evening, wherever you are.